The rain hammered against the windows of St. Mary's Cathedral as I stood beside my grandmother's casket, clutching a tissue that had long since become useless. Margaret Eleanor Whitmore had been 93 when she passed, but even at that age, she'd possessed a sharpness that could cut through steel and a wit that could make you laugh until your sides ached. Now she lay still, surrounded by white lilies, her favorite, and the soft murmur of mourners paying their final respects. "She looks peaceful," my husband David whispered beside me, his hand finding mine. His touch, usually comforting, felt oddly cold today. I attributed it to the chill of the old cathedral and the weight of grief pressing down on all of us. "She always said she wanted to go out on her own terms," I replied, my voice barely audible above the organ music. "I suppose she did." Grandmother had been more than family to me. She'd been my anchor, my confidant, and my greatest supporter. When my parents died in a car accident when I was 16, she'd taken me in without hesitation, raising me through my tumultuous teenage years and putting me through college. She'd walked me down the aisle when I married David 5 years ago, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she told me how proud she was of the woman I'd become. The service was beautiful, filled with stories of grandmother's remarkable life. She'd been a pioneering businesswoman in the 1960s, building a small textile company into a multi-million-dollar empire at a time when few women were taken seriously in boardrooms. Even after retiring, she'd remained sharp, managing her investments and properties with the precision of someone half her age. Before we go on, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any content, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. As the final hymn played, I noticed David checking his phone repeatedly, his jaw tense. When I asked if everything was all right, he simply nodded and squeezed my hand, but something in his expression made my stomach twist with unease. After the burial, we gathered at grandmother's sprawling Victorian home for the traditional post-funeral reception. The house, which had always felt warm and alive with her presence, now seemed hollow despite being filled with relatives, friends, and business associates. I moved through the rooms mechanically, accepting condolences and sharing memories, but my mind kept drifting to the empty chair by the fireplace where grandmother used to sit with her evening tea. "Sarah, dear," called my great-aunt Millicent, approaching with a plate of sandwiches. "You're looking pale. Have you eaten anything today?" I couldn't remember the last time I'd had a proper meal. The past week had been a blur of hospital visits, funeral arrangements, and phone calls to distant relatives. "I'm fine, Aunt Millicent. Just tired. Grief is exhausting," she said, patting my arm gently. "But Margaret would want you to take care of yourself. You know how she worried about you working too hard at that marketing firm." I managed a weak smile. David had been supportive throughout grandmother's illness, driving me to the hospital for visits and handling practical matters when I was too emotional to function. Yet today, something felt different. He'd been distracted during the service, and now I watched him across the room, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with his brother Marcus near the kitchen door. "The will reading is scheduled for Thursday," Aunt Millicent continued, lowering her voice. "I assume you and David will be there?" "Of course." The will reading. In my grief, I'd barely given it a thought, but I knew it was coming. Grandmother had mentioned it in passing during one of our last conversations, assuring me that everything was taken care of, and that I shouldn't worry about such things while she was sick. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd gradually thinned. David had volunteered to help clean up, but I noticed he spent most of his time in whispered conversations with his brother rather than actually helping. Marcus worked as a paralegal at a law firm downtown, not the same firm handling grandmother's estate, but he'd always fancied himself knowledgeable about legal matters. "Ready to head home?" David asked as the last guests were leaving. His smile seemed forced, not reaching his eyes. "I think I'd like to stay a bit longer," I said, looking around the house that had been my sanctuary for so many years. "Just to, I don't know, say goodbye properly." "I'll wait in the car," he said quickly, already reaching for his coat. "Take your time." His eagerness to leave struck me as odd, but I was too emotionally drained to analyze it further. I wandered through the rooms alone, touching familiar objects and letting memories wash over me. In grandmother's study, I paused at her antique desk, where she'd spent countless hours managing her business affairs. The surface was surprisingly clear. Usually, it was covered with financial documents, correspondence, and her ever-present legal pad filled with notes in her precise handwriting. A framed photograph caught my eye. Grandmother and me at my college graduation, both of us grinning widely. She'd been so proud that day, telling everyone within earshot about her granddaughter, the marketing graduate. "You have a good head for business," she'd told me later. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I picked up the frame, remembering how she'd always encouraged my career ambitions, even when David had suggested I might be happier staying home and starting a family. "A woman should be able to stand on her own 2 feet, she'd said more than once. "Never depend entirely on anyone else, no matter how much you love them." At the time, I'd thought she was being old-fashioned, a product of her generation's struggles. Now, standing in her empty study, I wondered if there had been more wisdom in those words than I'd realized. "Sarah," David's voice called from the front hall. "The cleaning crew wants to lock up." I carefully placed the photograph back on the desk and took one last look around the room that had shaped so much of who I'd become. As I turned to leave, something on the floor caught my eye, a small piece of paper that must have fallen behind the desk. I bent to pick it up and saw it was a business card for Henderson, Walsh & Associates, the law firm handling grandmother's estate. On the back, in grandmother's distinctive handwriting, were the words, "Trust no one completely, S will understand." A chill ran down my spine. S, that was me, Sarah. But understand what? And why would grandmother write something so cryptic about trust? "Sarah!" David's voice was sharper now, tinged with impatience. I slipped the business card into my purse and headed for the front door, my mind racing. As David helped me into the car, I studied his profile in the dim light of the street lamps. The man I'd married 5 years ago seemed like a stranger tonight, his familiar features somehow foreign and unreadable. "You okay?" he asked, noticing my scrutiny. "Just thinking about everything," I said carefully. "The will reading is Thursday. I wonder what grandmother left me." David's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Probably some jewelry, maybe a small inheritance. You know how these things go with older relatives. But I didn't know how these things went. My parents had died young, with no significant assets to leave behind. Grandmother was the only wealthy relative I'd ever had, and she'd never discussed her estate plans in detail. She'd only said that I was taken care of and that I should trust the process. As we drove through the rain-slicked streets toward our apartment, I found myself thinking about that business card and its cryptic message. What had grandmother wanted me to understand? And why did I have the growing feeling that the will reading on Thursday was going to change everything? David reached over and squeezed my hand, but instead of comfort, his touch now filled me with an inexplicable sense of dread. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones, and somehow I knew that whatever it was about to tear my carefully constructed life apart. The next 2 days passed in a haze of grief and mounting anxiety. I'd taken bereavement leave from my job at Morrison Marketing, where I worked as a senior account manager, but sitting at home with nothing but my thoughts for company was proving more torturous than any client presentation I'd ever endured. David had been unusually attentive, bringing me tea, ordering takeout from my favorite restaurants, and generally hovering in a way that might have seemed caring, but felt increasingly suffocating. Every time I mentioned the will reading, he'd quickly change the subject or suggest I should focus on healing from my loss, rather than worrying about material matters. Grandmother always said I was like her, I told him Tuesday evening as we sat on our couch, a barely touched plate of Thai food growing cold between us. She used to joke that I inherited her stubborn streak and her head for business. David murmured absently, scrolling through his phone. "That's nice, honey." "She also said I inherited her intuition about people," I continued, watching his face carefully. She could always tell when someone wasn't being completely honest with her. That got his attention. His head snapped up, and for just a moment I saw something flicker across his features. Fear? Guilt? It was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, setting his phone aside. "Nothing specific, just remembering the things she used to say." I picked at my pad thai, my appetite non-existent. "David, is there something you're not telling me? You've been acting strange since the funeral." "I'm grieving too, Sarah. Margaret was like a grandmother to me as well." His voice carried a defensive edge that made my unease deepen. "I'm just trying to be supportive while dealing with my own emotions." It was true that grandmother had grown fond of David over the years, but calling her like a grandmother to him seemed like an overstatement. She'd been polite, welcoming him into the family, but their relationship had always been cordial rather than close. If anything, I'd sometimes sensed a subtle wariness in her interactions with him, though she'd never said anything directly. That night, I lay awake, listening to David's breathing beside me, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of the growing pit of anxiety in my stomach. The business card from grandmother's study lay on my nightstand, its cryptic message seeming to pulse in the darkness. "Trust no one completely. S will understand." Whoa, what was I supposed to understand? And why had she felt the need to hide this message behind her desk, as if she expected someone might come looking for it? Wednesday morning brought unexpected clarity in the form of a phone call from Jennifer Walsh, one of the attorneys handling grandmother's estate. "Mrs. Morrison, this is Jennifer Walsh from Henderson, Walsh & Associates. I wanted to confirm your attendance at tomorrow's will reading and address a rather unusual situation that's come to our attention." Unusual situation? I sat up straighter at my kitchen table, David's coffee mug freezing halfway to his lips. "We've received several calls from your husband inquiring about the specifics of your grandmother's will. While we appreciate family members' interest in understanding the process, we can only discuss estate matters with the named beneficiaries directly." My blood turned to ice. "David called you?" "Multiple times, actually. Yesterday and again this morning. He seemed particularly interested in knowing whether certain documents would be presented at the reading." Ms. Walsh's professional tone couldn't quite mask her concern. "I wanted to make you aware, as it's somewhat irregular for a spouse to make such inquiries without the primary beneficiary present." I stared at David, who had gone completely still, his face carefully blank. I wasn't aware he'd called. Thank you for letting me know." "Of course. We'll see you tomorrow at 2:00. And Mrs. Morrison, your grandmother left specific instructions about the reading. She wanted to ensure everything was handled according to her exact wishes." After I hung up, the silence in our kitchen stretched like a taut wire. David carefully set down his coffee mug and cleared his throat. "I can explain," he said. "I'm listening. I was just trying to help. You've been so upset, and I thought if I could get some information about what to expect, I could prepare you better. I didn't want you to be blindsided by anything complicated." His explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, but something about it felt rehearsed, like he'd been practicing this response. "What kind of complications were you worried about?" "Well, estate taxes, complicated bequests, maybe disputes with other family members. These things can get messy, and you're already dealing with so much grief." "David," I leaned forward, studying his face intently. "What aren't you telling me?" For a moment, he looked like he might crack, might finally tell me whatever truth he'd been hiding. But then his expression hardened and he stood up abruptly. "I'm telling you, I was trying to help my grieving wife. If that's somehow suspicious to you, then maybe you're not thinking clearly right now." He grabbed his coat from the back of his chair. "I'm going to the office. Try to get some rest before tomorrow." After he left, I sat alone in our kitchen, my mind racing. David worked as a financial advisor at a mid-sized firm downtown, and while he'd always been interested in money and investments, his behavior around grandmother's estate felt different, more urgent, more desperate. I found myself thinking about our marriage, really examining it for the first time in months. When had we last had a deep conversation about our future? When had he last seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts, my dreams, my goals? Lately, it felt like we were going through the motions of being married without any real connection. There had been signs, I realized now. Small things that I dismissed or rationalized away. Credit card bills that seemed higher than they should be. Phone calls he'd taken another room. His insistence that I didn't need to worry about our finances, that he'd handle everything. His subtle but persistent suggestions that I might want to consider leaving my job and focusing on starting a family. A woman should be able to stand on her own 2 feet. Grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. Never depend entirely on anyone else, no matter how much you love them. Peter. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done before. I logged into our joint bank account online to check our financial situation. What I found made my hands shake as I stared at the computer screen. Our savings account, which should have contained nearly $30,000, held less than $5,000. Our checking account showed a pattern of large withdrawals over the past 6 months. Cash withdrawals that I hadn't made and didn't remember David mentioning. There were also several payments to something called Meridian Holdings that I'd never heard of. I grabbed my phone and called our bank, my heart pounding. Mrs. Morrison? Yes, I can help you with information about your account. You're asking about the withdrawals. Let me see. Yes, those were all made by the secondary account holder, your husband, with his debit card and PIN. The payments to Meridian Holdings? Those appear to be investment-related transfers. You'd need to speak with your husband about the specifics as he initiated all of those transactions. After hanging up, I sat in stunned silence. $25,000 gone, transferred to some company I'd never heard of, without my knowledge or consent. Money that represented years of careful saving, money that was supposed to be our emergency fund, our down payment on a house, our security blanket. I thought about David's expensive new watch, which he'd claimed was a bonus gift from his company, his sudden interest in golf, complete with premium equipment and country club membership fees, the weekend trips with clients that seemed to happen more and more frequently. But it was more than just the money. It was the deception, the calculated way he'd hidden this from me while playing the role of loving, supportive husband. How long had this been going on? What else didn't I know about the man I'd married? As evening approached, I found myself pacing our apartment like a caged animal, my mind churning with questions and suspicions. When David finally came home, carrying flowers and wearing his most charming smile, I felt like I was seeing him clearly for the first time in years. "Peace offering," he said, holding out the bouquet of roses. "I'm sorry about this morning." "You're right. I should have discussed calling the lawyers with you first." I took the flowers mechanically, studying his face. The man standing in our entryway looked like my husband, sounded like my husband, but felt like a stranger, wearing David's skin. "We need to talk," I said quietly. Something flickered in his eyes, that same flash of fear I'd glimpsed the night before. "Of course, but first, let me make dinner. You haven't been eating enough, and tomorrow's going to be a long day." Tomorrow. The will reading. Whatever grandmother had wanted me to understand, I had a feeling I was about to find out. And based on David's increasingly desperate attempts to control the situation, I suspected that understanding was going to change everything. As he bustled around our kitchen, chattering about his day and asking about mine, I clutched grandmother's business card in my pocket and made a silent promise to her memory. Whatever truth was waiting for me tomorrow, I would face it with the strength and wisdom she'd tried to teach me. I just hoped I was strong enough for whatever was coming. Thursday morning arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to seep into my bones as I dressed for the will reading. I'd barely slept, my mind churning with questions about our missing savings and David's increasingly erratic behavior. He'd been up before dawn, claiming he couldn't sleep and needed to go for a run, but I'd heard him on the phone in the bathroom, his voice low and urgent. "You look nice," he said when I emerged from our bedroom in my black dress, the same one I'd worn to the funeral. Professional. "Did you?" There was something in the way he said "professional" that made my skin crawl, as if he were commenting on a costume I was wearing rather than simply noting my appearance. I studied his reflection in the hallway mirror as he adjusted his tie, noting the tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes kept darting away from mine. "Are you nervous about something?" I asked. "Just want everything to go smoothly for you," he replied, but his smile felt forced. "These legal proceedings can be overwhelming when you're still grieving." The law offices of Henderson Walsh and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming downtown building. As we rode the elevator to the 15th floor, David's leg bounced restlessly, and I caught him checking his phone repeatedly. "Expecting an important call?" I asked. "Just work stuff," he muttered, but he powered off the phone entirely, something I'd never seen him do during business hours. The conference room was already occupied when we arrived. I recognized several faces: grandmother's longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, her business partner from the textile company, Robert Hartwell, and a few distant cousins I'd met at family gatherings over the years. What surprised me was seeing Marcus, David's brother, sitting near the far end of the polished mahogany table. "Marcus?" I said, confused. "I didn't know you'd be here." He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact. "Margaret asked me to be present. Something about, well, we'll find out, I suppose." Jennifer Walsh, the attorney I'd spoken with on the phone, entered carrying a thick folder and what appeared to be a sealed envelope. She was a woman in her 50s, with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Thank you all for coming," she began, settling at the head of the table. "Before we begin with the formal reading, I need to address some unusual circumstances surrounding Mrs. Whitmore's final wishes." My pulse quickened. Beside me, David had gone very still. "Mrs. Whitmore came to see me 3 months before her death," Ms. Walsh continued, "with some very specific concerns about her estate. She'd discovered certain irregularities that caused her to make significant changes to her will. She also left explicit instructions about how this reading was to be conducted." She opened the sealed envelope and withdrew a letter written in grandmother's familiar handwriting. She asked that I read this aloud before presenting the formal will. Ms. Walsh cleared her throat and began. "To my beloved granddaughter Sarah, and to all gathered here today, if you are hearing this letter, then I am gone, and it is time for certain truths to come to light. Sarah, my dear, I discovered something 3 months ago that broke my heart, but also made me immensely proud of the strength I know you possess. I learned that your husband David has been systematically stealing from you, manipulating your finances, and worse. He attempted to gain access to information about my estate through deception and fraud. He has been planning to hide your inheritance from you, believing he could claim it as marital property and continue his pattern of financial abuse." The words hit me like physical blows. Around the table, I heard gasps and murmurs, but they seemed to come from very far away. David had gone white as paper, his hands clenched into fists on the table. Ms. Walsh continued reading. "Marcus Morrison, I trusted you when you approached me claiming to represent Sarah's interests. Instead, you conspired with your brother to gain unauthorized access to my financial information. The fake power of attorney you presented to my bank was poorly forged, gentlemen, and easily detected by anyone with half a brain. Sarah, my darling girl, I have left you everything. The house, the business interests, the investments, all of it. But more importantly, I have left you the truth. In this room today, you will find copies of bank records, phone recordings, and other evidence of your husband's betrayal. You deserve so much better than a man who sees you as a source of income rather than a partner in life." My vision blurred as tears began to fall. Across the table, I saw Mrs. Chen dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, while Robert Hartwell looked like he wanted to leap across the table and throttle David with his bare hands. "There's more," Ms. Walsh said gently. "I know this is painful, Sarah, but I also know you are stronger than you realize. You have my business instincts, my stubborn streak, and my ability to land on your feet, no matter what life throws at you. Do not let anyone, not even your husband, convince you to settle for less than you deserve. Take what is yours and build the life you want. Trust yourself, my dear one. Trust yourself above all others." The silence that followed was deafening. Then David exploded. "This is insane!" He shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger and desperation. That old woman was losing her mind. She was paranoid, seeing conspiracies where none existed. "Sit down, Mr. Morrison," Ms. Walsh said coolly. "We're not finished. I don't have to listen to this character assassination. Sarah, you know me. You know I love you. We can contest this will, prove she wasn't mentally competent." "David." My voice came out surprisingly steady, despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "Sit down." Something in my tone must have penetrated his panic, because he slowly lowered himself back into his chair, though his entire body vibrated with tension. Ms. Walsh opened her folder and began distributing documents. As Mrs. Whitmore mentioned, she gathered extensive evidence of the financial fraud being perpetrated against her granddaughter, bank records showing unauthorized access attempts, recordings of phone calls between the Morrison brothers discussing strategies to access the estate, and documentation of the forged power of attorney. She placed a stack of papers in front of me, and even through my emotional turmoil, I could see the damning evidence laid out in black and white. Bank statements showing David's attempts to gain information about grandmother's accounts. Transcripts of recorded conversations between David and Marcus, discussing how to handle the Sarah situation and ensure the inheritance didn't slip through their fingers. But it was the final document that made my blood turned to ice. A copy of a life insurance policy that David had taken out on me 6 months ago, listing himself as the sole beneficiary. A policy I'd never signed, never even known existed. That's not what it looks like," David stammered, seeing my expression as I stared at the insurance documents. "I was just planning for our future, making sure you'd be taken care of." "You forged my signature," I whispered, holding up the policy application. Even in my shock, I could see that the signature was a clumsy imitation of my own handwriting. "You took out $1 million life insurance policy on me without my knowledge." "Sarah, let me explain. Were you planning to kill me?" The question came out flat and matter-of-fact, which somehow made it even more chilling. "What? No! God, no! I would never! It was just insurance, just in case something happened." "Something like what, David? Like what exactly did you think might happen to me?" He couldn't answer, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Beside him, Marcus had slumped in his chair, looking like he wanted to disappear entirely. Ms. Walsh cleared her throat. "There's one more thing, Mrs. Morrison. Your grandmother instructed me to have divorce papers prepared and ready for your signature today, if you chose to use them. She suspected you might want to take immediate action once you learned the truth." She slid another folder across the table to me. "These papers would freeze all marital assets pending a full investigation, ensure you maintain control of your inheritance, and provide for immediate separation. All you need to do is sign." I stared down at the divorce papers, my hands trembling. 5 years of marriage, 5 years of believing I was loved, protected, cherished. 5 years of being systematically betrayed and manipulated by the man I'd trusted most in the world. "Sarah, please," David said, his voice breaking. "Don't make any rash decisions. We can work through this. Marriage counseling, therapy, whatever you want. I made mistakes, but I love you." "Love?" I looked up at him, and for the first time in days, my vision felt completely clear. "You took out a life insurance policy on me without my knowledge. You stole our savings. You tried to steal my inheritance. You conspired with your brother to defraud my dying grandmother. That's not love, David. That's predation." I picked up the pen Ms. Walsh offered and signed my name on the divorce papers with steady strokes. The sound of the pen scratching across paper seemed unnaturally loud in the silent conference room. "Sarah, no!" David lunged forward, but Robert Hartwell, who despite being in his 70s was still surprisingly spry, caught his arm. "I think you've done enough damage, son. Robert said quietly. "Let the lady make her own choices." As I signed the final page, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not the breaking I'd expected, but a strange sense of liberation. The fear and confusion that had plagued me for days began to transform into something else. Anger, clean, clarifying anger that burned away the last of my self-doubt. "The inheritance," I said to Ms. Walsh, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "What exactly did grandmother leave me?" "Everything," she replied with a small smile. "The house and all its contents, her stock portfolio valued at approximately $2.7 million, the remaining interest in Hartwell Whitmore Textiles, and various other assets. The total estate value is just over $4 million. $4 million. I'd known grandmother was well off, but I'd had no idea she was worth that much. No wonder David had been so desperate to get his hands on information about the will. "This isn't over," David said, his desperation giving way to cold fury. "I'm your husband. I have rights to marital property. I'll fight this in court." "With what money?" I asked. "From what I can see, you've already spent most of our savings. And now that I know about Meridian Holdings, your little shell company for hiding stolen money, I'll be freezing those assets too." His face went ashen. He hadn't realized I'd discovered that particular piece of his deception. "Sarah," Marcus spoke for the first time since the reading began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. This wasn't supposed to. David said you'd never find out, that we were just trying to secure your future together." "Stop talking," David hissed at his brother, but it was too late. "You were both planning to steal from me," I said, the full scope of their betrayal finally becoming clear. "How long has this been going on? How long have you been planning this?" Neither of them answered, but I could see the truth in their faces. This hadn't been a recent decision born of desperation. It had been a long-term strategy, possibly dating back to the early days of our marriage. Ms. Walsh began gathering the papers. "Mrs. Morrison, I should mention that your grandmother also established a trust fund that will provide you with a monthly income while you decide how to manage the rest of the inheritance. You won't have to worry about immediate financial concerns while you're adjusting to your new circumstances. New circumstances. New life." The enormity of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. In the span of an hour, I'd gone from being a financially dependent wife to a wealthy, independent woman. From being a victim of fraud to being in control of my own destiny. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Ms. Walsh said, "you go home and start planning your future. The divorce proceedings will move forward, the estate will be transferred to your name, and your husband will be facing some very serious criminal charges for fraud and forgery." As we all began to file out of the conference room, David made one last desperate attempt to reach me. "Sarah, please, just talk to me. Alone. Let me explain everything. There are things you don't understand." I turned to face him one final time, this man who had shared my bed and my dreams and my trust for 5 years. "The only thing I don't understand, David, is how I could have been so blind for so long. But grandmother saw you clearly, didn't she? That's why she never really warmed up to you. She knew what you were. She was a bitter old woman who couldn't stand to see you happy. She was the smartest person I ever knew. And she loved me enough to protect me, even from beyond the grave." I walked away from him then, from our marriage, from the life I'd thought I wanted. Ms. Walsh accompanied me to the elevator, where she handed me the keys to grandmother's house and a folder containing all the documents I'd need to begin my new life. "Your grandmother would be proud of you," she said, as the elevator doors began to close. "She always said you had steel in your spine. Today you proved her right." As the elevator descended, carrying me away from the wreckage of my marriage and toward an uncertain but suddenly bright future, I thought about grandmother's final gift to me. It hadn't just been money. It had been the truth and the strength to face it, the steel in my spine. I could feel it now, supporting me as I prepared to build a life that was entirely my own. The house felt different when I walked through the front door that evening. Not just because grandmother was gone, I'd felt that absence since the funeral, but because now it was truly mine. Every piece of furniture, every painting on the walls, every book in the mahogany-lined study belonged to me. More importantly, every decision about what happened next was mine to make. I'd driven here directly from the law office, needing space to process what had just occurred. David had followed me part way, calling my name from the sidewalk as I pulled into the driveway, but I'd ignored him, let him go back to our apartment and contemplate the spectacular implosion of his carefully laid plans. Mrs. Chen had left everything spotless, as always. In the kitchen, I found a casserole dish in the refrigerator with a note, "For when you're ready to eat again. Your grandmother always said food helps heal everything, even heartbreak. Call me if you need anything. Eleanor Chen." Dear Mrs. Chen. She'd worked for grandmother for 20 years, and I realized with a start that I was now her employer. Another responsibility in a day full of revelations that had turned my entire world upside down. I poured myself a glass of wine from grandmother's well-stocked cellar and wandered into the study, settling into the leather chair behind her desk. The room smelled faintly of her lavender perfume and the old books that lined the walls. It was here that she'd built her business empire, managed her investments, and apparently orchestrated her final gift to me. The business card I'd found after the funeral was still in my purse. I pulled it out and read the message again. "Trust no one completely. S will understand." How had she known? What had tipped her off to David's true nature? My phone buzzed with a text message. David, of course. "Sarah, please come home so we can talk. I know you're hurt and confused, but there's so much you don't understand. I love you. We can fix this." I deleted the message without responding and turned off my phone. I wasn't ready to deal with his attempts at manipulation. Not yet. I needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to move forward. Opening grandmother's laptop, I began scrolling through her emails, looking for clues about how she discovered David's deception. What I found was a folder labeled Sarah's Situation that contained months of correspondence with private investigators, banks, and Ms. Walsh. The investigation had apparently begun when David contacted grandmother directly, claiming he wanted to surprise me with information about my potential inheritance for our 5th anniversary. He'd spun an elaborate story about wanting to plan a special celebration, maybe even a second honeymoon, once we knew what we'd be working with financially. Grandmother, being the shrewd businesswoman she was, had found his interests suspicious. As she wrote in one email to her private investigator, "Something about that boy has always bothered me. Too charming, too interested in money, and he's never once asked Sarah about her own career goals or dreams. He treats her like a beautiful accessory, not a partner." The investigation had uncovered everything. The depleted savings account, the forged documents, the life insurance policy, and most damning of all, recorded conversations between David and Marcus, discussing their long-term strategy for accessing my inheritance. In one particularly chilling transcript, David had said, "Sarah's too trusting to ever suspect anything. She thinks I'm this devoted husband who handles all the boring financial stuff so she doesn't have to worry about it. By the time the old lady dies, we'll have everything positioned perfectly." Marcus had replied, "What if Sarah gets suspicious? What if she wants to be more involved in managing the money? Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. There are ways to handle stubborn wives." Reading those words, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Ways to handle stubborn wives. Combined with the life insurance policy, that phrase took on a sinister meaning that made my hands shake as I continued reading. Grandmother had been thorough in her investigation, but also careful. She'd never confronted David directly, never let on that she suspected anything. Instead, she'd quietly changed her will, gathered evidence, and prepared to protect me from beyond the grave. The woman who had taught me to be strong had used her final months to ensure I'd have the tools I needed to survive David's betrayal. A knock at the front door interrupted my reading. Through the window, I could see David's car in the driveway, and my heart rate spiked. I wasn't ready for this confrontation, but apparently it was coming whether I wanted it or not. "Sarah, please," he called through the door. "I know you're in there. Just give me 5 minutes to explain." I considered ignoring him, but something in his tone, a desperation that bordered on dangerous, made me think that might not be wise. Better to face him now, in a controlled situation, than to wonder when he might show up next. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. 5 minutes, David. Then you leave." He looked terrible. His hair disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes red-rimmed. "This is all a misunderstanding, Sarah. Your grandmother was sick, paranoid. She hired investigators to follow me, for God's sake. She was trying to break us up because she never thought I was good enough for you. So the bank records are fake? The recordings of you and Marcus planning to steal from me? We weren't stealing. We were planning for our future together. Yes, I moved some money around, but it was investments, trying to grow our nest egg without telling me, without my consent. And what about the life insurance policy I never signed?" His face flushed. Look, I was trying to protect you. If something happened to me, you'd be taken care of. I just didn't want to worry you with the paperwork. You're the beneficiary, David, not me. You took out $1 million policy on my life with you as the beneficiary. It's more complicated than that. There are tax advantages, estate planning benefits you don't understand. Stop lying to me." The words exploded out of me with such force that he actually took a step back. "I've heard the recordings, David. I know what you and Marcus were planning. I know about Meridian Holdings and the money you've been funneling into it. I know this whole marriage has been a con from the beginning." For a moment, his mask slipped completely, and I saw something cold and calculating in his eyes that made my blood freeze. Then, just as quickly, the desperate, pleading expression was back. "Okay, yes, I made mistakes. I got in over my head with some investments and I panicked. But I never stopped loving you, Sarah. Everything I did was because I was trying to build a life for us, trying to be the husband you deserved, by stealing from me, by forging my signature, by taking out life insurance on me. I was never going to hurt you. The insurance was just in case, just good financial planning. Get out." My voice was steady, but inside I was screaming, "Get out of my house and don't come back. Sarah, please, if you're not off this property in 60 seconds, I'm calling the police." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him calculating, trying to figure out if there was any angle left to play, any manipulation that might still work. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "I'm still your husband. I still have rights." "Not for long." I started to close the door, then paused. "David, how long were you planning this? How long have you been lying to me?" He was silent for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. "Then, does it matter now?" "It matters to me since the beginning," he said finally, not meeting my eyes. "Since the day I found out who your grandmother was, what she was worth. Marcus looked into your family background before I even asked you on our first date. The admission hit me like a physical blow. Our entire relationship, the romance, the proposal, the wedding, 5 years of what I'd thought was love, had all been an elaborate fraud. I'd never been a wife to him. I'd been a mark. "Get out," I whispered, and this time I did slam the door. I leaned against it, listening to his footsteps retreat down the walkway, to his car door slamming, to the engine starting. Only when I heard him drive away did I allow myself to slide down the door to the floor, where I sat and cried until there were no tears left. But even through the grief and shock, I could feel something else growing inside me, a fierce, burning determination. David had stolen 5 years of my life, but he wouldn't steal another day. Grandmother had given me the tools to fight back, and I was going to use every single one of them. I picked myself up off the floor, walked back to the study, and began making a list of everything I needed to do. First, I'd contact Ms. Walsh to ensure the divorce proceedings moved forward as quickly as possible. Then I'd work with the investigators to build the strongest possible criminal case against both David and Marcus. I'd also need to secure all of grandmother's assets, change every password and account number, and make sure David couldn't access anything that belonged to me. As I wrote, I found myself thinking about what grandmother had said in her letter, "Trust yourself above all others." For too long, I'd trusted David more than my own instincts, dismissed my own doubts in favor of his reassurances. Never again. My phone buzzed with another text from David. "I'll give you time to cool down, but we need to talk about this rationally. I'm not the villain you think I am." I blocked his number and then called Ms. Walsh's emergency line. "Mrs. Morrison, is everything all right? David came to the house tonight. He's not going to give up easily. I need to know what legal protections I have, what I need to do to keep myself safe. I'll have a restraining order filed first thing tomorrow morning. In the meantime, I'd recommend staying somewhere he can't find you, just to be safe." But as I looked around grandmother's study, with its solid walls and strong locks, I realized I didn't want to run. This was my house now, my sanctuary. If anyone was going to leave, it would be David. "Actually," I said, "I think I'll stay right here. But I might invest in a good security system." Ms. Walsh chuckled. "Your grandmother would approve. She always said the best defense is a strong offense." After hanging up, I walked through the house room by room, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't just a beautiful old Victorian anymore. It was my fortress, my base of operations. From here I would rebuild my life on my own terms. In grandmother's bedroom, I found a framed photograph I'd never noticed before, a much younger version of her, standing in front of her textile factory, wearing a hard hat and a determined expression. On the back, in her handwriting, "First day as owner-operator 1963. They said a woman couldn't run a business. I proved them wrong." I smiled through my tears. Grandmother had faced down skeptics and sexists to build her empire. I could certainly handle one lying, cheating husband and his accomplice brother. David had made a critical error in his planning. He'd assumed I was weak, that I'd crumble under pressure, that I'd be so devastated by his betrayal that I'd be easy to manipulate. He'd counted on me being the same trusting, dependent woman I'd been when we married. But I wasn't that woman anymore. Loss and betrayal had burned away my naivety, leaving something harder and stronger in its place. I had grandmother's intelligence, her resources, and her steel spine. Most importantly, I had the truth on my side. As I prepared for bed in what was now truly my own house, I made a promise to myself and to grandmother's memory. David Morrison had stolen 5 years of my life, but his theft had come to an end. From now on, I would trust myself, fight for myself, and build a life worthy of the woman who had loved me enough to save me. The war wasn't over, but I'd won the first battle, and I was just getting started. 3 weeks after the will reading, I was discovering that divorce was less about ending a marriage and more about waging war on multiple fronts simultaneously. David had hired an aggressive attorney who was challenging everything: the validity of grandmother's will, my right to the inheritance as marital property, even my mental competency to make major decisions so soon after a traumatic loss. "He's throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks," Ms. Walsh explained during one of our strategy meetings in grandmother's study. "It's a common tactic when the opposing party is desperate." "How desperate?" I asked, signing another set of affidavits that would freeze David's access to any accounts that might contain marital assets. "Desperate enough to make some very poor choices. Our investigator discovered that David took out a second mortgage on your apartment without your knowledge, using forged documents. He's also been liquidating assets and hiding money in offshore accounts." I looked up from the papers, my blood running cold. "He's planning to run." That's our assessment as well, which is why we're moving to have him arrested for fraud before he can disappear with whatever money he hasn't already hidden. The thought of David fleeing the country with stolen money should have terrified me, but instead I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. His desperation meant he knew he was caught, that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling around him. Good. My phone rang, interrupting our meeting. The caller ID showed my workplace number. Sarah, it's Janet. Janet Morrison, my boss at the marketing firm. And yes, the irony of the shared last name had not escaped me. I know you're on bereavement leave, but we need to discuss your employment status. A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean? David called the office yesterday. He said you were having some kind of mental breakdown, that you might not be able to return to work for quite some time. He suggested we might want to consider your position carefully. I gripped the phone tighter. David has no authority to speak for me about my employment or anything else. I know that, which is why I'm calling you directly. But Sarah, he seemed to know details about your performance reviews and current projects that he shouldn't have access to. I'm concerned he might have gotten into your work email or files somehow. Another violation, another betrayal. I closed my eyes and tried to center myself. Janet, I'll be returning to work next Monday as scheduled, and I need to report a potential security breach. My soon-to-be ex-husband may have accessed confidential company information. Soon-to-be ex-husband. Janet's voice rose in surprise. Sarah, what's going on? I gave her the abbreviated version, enough to explain why David's claims about my mental state were fabricated, not enough to turn my personal drama into office gossip. By the time I hung up, Ms. Walsh was looking at me with approval. You handled that well, but we need to assume David has been monitoring your communications for some time. Email, phone, possibly even your location, if he had access to your devices. The invasion of privacy made my skin crawl, but it also clarified something important. David wasn't just an opportunistic thief. He was a systematic predator who had been monitoring and controlling me for years without my knowledge. What do I do about work? I can't afford to lose my job on top of everything else. Even with the inheritance, I wasn't ready to make any major career changes while my life was in upheaval. Actually, Ms. Walsh said with a small smile, you might want to reconsider that assumption. Your grandmother's estate includes a substantial investment portfolio that's been generating considerable income for years. You're not just wealthy on paper, you have significant monthly cash flow. You could afford to take some time off to deal with this situation, or even pursue other opportunities if you wanted. Other opportunities. The phrase resonated in a way I hadn't expected. When was the last time I'd thought about what I actually wanted to do with my career, rather than just focusing on financial security and David's approval? That evening, I was reviewing financial documents when Mrs. Chen arrived with groceries and another casserole. You're too thin, she announced, bustling into the kitchen, and you're working too much. Your grandmother worried about the same things. Mrs. Chen, I said, following her into the kitchen, I need to ask you something. Did you ever suspect anything about David? Did grandmother ever say anything to you about him? She paused in her unpacking, considering her words carefully. Your grandmother was a good judge of character. She never said anything directly, but she shook her head. After you married him, she started locking her study when he visited. She never did that before. She locked her study every time he came to the house. She would put away all her papers, lock the desk drawers, even turn off her computer. When I asked her about it, she just said it was good security practice. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Grandmother had been protecting her financial information from David long before she discovered his theft. Her instincts had been warning her about him for years. There's something else, Mrs. Chen continued. The week before she died, she gave me this. She pulled a sealed envelope from her purse, my name written on it in grandmother's handwriting. She said to give it to you after the lawyers finished their work. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message. Sarah, my dearest girl, if you're reading this, then you know the truth about David, and you're probably feeling lost and angry and betrayed. All of those feelings are valid and necessary, but don't let them consume you. You have so much life ahead of you, so many possibilities. The money I'm leaving you isn't just an inheritance, it's freedom. Freedom to choose your own path, to take risks, to build something meaningful. Don't waste it on safe choices or other people's expectations. Be bold, my dear one. Be bold and be brilliant and be entirely yourself. The world needs what you have to offer. All my love, grandmother. I sank into a kitchen chair, tears streaming down my face. Even in death, she was still taking care of me, still believing in me when I struggled to believe in myself. She loved you very much, Mrs. Chen said softly, but she also believed you were stronger than you knew. She used to say you reminded her of herself at your age, too trusting sometimes, but with steel underneath. Steel underneath. I was beginning to feel it, that core of strength that had been buried under years of David's subtle manipulation and control. Every lie he'd told, every choice he'd made for me, every time he'd dismissed my opinions or dreams, it had all been designed to keep me dependent and compliant. But I wasn't that woman anymore. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Sarah, this is Marcus. We need to talk. There are things about David you don't know. Things that put you in danger. Meet me tomorrow at Cafe Luna at noon. Come alone. I showed the message to Mrs. Chen, who frowned deeply. That man helped his brother steal from you. Why would he want to help you now? Maybe he's getting nervous about the criminal charges. Or maybe David's planning something that even Marcus thinks has gone too far. Either way, I wasn't about to meet Marcus alone in some cafe. But I was curious about what he thought was so urgent that he'd risk contacting me directly. I forwarded the message to Ms. Walsh and then called her office. Don't go, she said immediately. It's obviously a trap of some kind. What if it's not? What if he really does have information about David that I need to know? Then he can share it with the police when they arrest him. Sarah, these men have already shown they're willing to forge documents and commit fraud. They've escalated their criminal behavior once. There's no reason to think they won't do it again. I knew she was right, but something about Marcus's message nagged at me. The phrase, things that put you in danger, suggested a level of threat I hadn't fully considered. What if David's contingency plans went beyond hiding money and fleeing the country? That night, I had the security system installed. Motion sensors, cameras, and a direct line to a monitoring service that would dispatch police if needed. I also bought pepper spray and enrolled in a self-defense class that started the following week. As I set the alarm for the first time, I thought about how much my life had changed in just 3 weeks. I'd gone from being a trusting wife to a suspicious divorcee, from financial dependence to sudden wealth, from passive acceptance to active self-protection. David had expected his betrayal to destroy me. Instead, it was making me stronger than I'd ever imagined possible. But Marcus's warning stayed with me as I tried to sleep. What dangers was he talking about? And was I prepared for whatever David might try next? The answer to Marcus's cryptic warning came sooner than I expected, and from a direction I never saw coming. I was at work on Friday morning, trying to focus on a campaign presentation for a major client, when Janet knocked on my office door. Sarah, there are 2 police officers here to see you. They say it's urgent. My heart stopped. Had something happened to David? Had he been arrested? As I followed Janet to the conference room, my mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Detective Rodriguez and Officer Kim were waiting for me, their expressions serious, but not unkind. Mrs. Morrison, we need to ask you some questions about your whereabouts last night between 8 and 11 p.m. My whereabouts? I was at home. Why? Your husband's apartment was broken into last night. He was assaulted and hospitalized. He's claiming you were responsible. The room seemed to tilt sideways. He's claiming I attacked him. He says you came to his apartment, threatened him, and when he refused to discuss reconciliation, you hit him with a lamp. He has a concussion and several stitches. I stared at them in disbelief. I haven't been to David's apartment since I moved out 3 weeks ago. I've been staying at my grandmother's house, and I have a security system that will show I was there all evening. Detective Rodriguez made a note. We'll need to verify that. Can anyone else confirm your whereabouts? Mrs. Chen, my grandmother's former housekeeper, came by around 7 with dinner. She stayed until almost 9:30. We watched a movie together. We'll need her contact information. Mrs. Morrison, I have to ask, have you made any threats against your husband recently? Any contact at all? None. My attorney advised me not to communicate with him directly, and I've been following that advice. Detective, David has been systematically stealing from me for years. He forged documents, emptied our savings, even took out a life insurance policy on me without my knowledge. Why would I jeopardize my divorce case by attacking him? The officers exchanged a look. You're in the middle of divorce proceedings, contentious ones. He's fighting the division of assets, claiming my inheritance should be considered marital property. This accusation, it's clearly an attempt to make me look unstable or violent. That's possible, Detective Rodriguez acknowledged, but we still need to investigate the claim. Do you own any lamps that match the description of the weapon used? I have no idea what lamps David owns or doesn't own. As I said, I haven't been to his apartment in weeks. They took my statement, collected Mrs. Chen's contact information, and left me with instructions not to leave town while they investigated. As soon as they were gone, I called Ms. Walsh. This is escalation, she said grimly. David's realizing that his legal challenges aren't working, so he's trying to create a criminal case against you. If he can get you arrested for assault, it would strengthen his position in the divorce proceedings. But I didn't do it. I have an alibi. I know, but he's counting on the fact that domestic violence accusations are taken seriously and that even false charges can do significant damage to your reputation and legal standing. I sank into my office chair, feeling suddenly exhausted. What do I do? First, we verify your alibi with the security footage and Mrs. Chen's testimony. Then we look very carefully at David's story for inconsistencies. Men don't usually falsely accuse their wives of assault unless they're desperate or unless they're setting up something bigger. Something bigger. The phrase sent ice through my veins. Ms. Walsh, what if David hurt himself? What if this whole thing is staged? That's actually not as far-fetched as it sounds. Self-inflicted injuries aren't uncommon in false accusation cases, especially when someone has a lot to lose financially. I thought about Marcus's warning message, which I still hadn't responded to. Things that put you in danger. What if he'd been trying to warn me about this exact scenario? I need to talk to Marcus, I said suddenly. Absolutely not. If David is willing to falsely accuse you of assault, there's no telling what other traps he might be setting. But as I sat in my office, staring out at the city skyline, I realized I was tired of being reactive, tired of waiting for David's next move. Maybe it was time to take some control of the situation. That afternoon, I texted Marcus back, Café Luna, 3 p.m. I'll have someone with me. His response was immediate. Come alone or don't come at all. This is about your safety. Then call me. I'm not meeting you in person. My phone rang 5 minutes later. Sarah, thank God. Listen to me carefully. David has completely lost it. The assault last night, he did it to himself. What? I was there when he planned it. He hit himself with the lamp, called 911, and told them you'd attacked him. He thinks if he can get you arrested, it will give him leverage in the divorce. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. Why are you telling me this? Because this was supposed to be about money, not about hurting you. David's talking about more serious things now, about making sure you can't testify against him, about permanent solutions to his problems. Permanent solutions. The life insurance policy flashed through my mind. Marcus, are you saying he's planning to kill me? I'm saying he's desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. He keeps talking about how everything would be simpler if you just weren't around to complicate things. Why should I believe you? You've been helping him steal from me for months. Because I'm scared too. David's not the same person he was when we started this. He's become obsessed, paranoid. He blames you for everything that's gone wrong, even though it was his own greed that caused this mess. What do you want from me? I want to make a deal. I'll testify against David, tell the police everything I know about his plans, in exchange for immunity from prosecution. I closed my eyes, trying to think clearly through the fear and adrenaline. I can't make that deal. You'd have to talk to the prosecutors. Then set up a meeting. Sarah, I'm serious about this. David has weapons now. He's been practicing at shooting ranges. He's researching your daily routines, your security system, everything. The blood drained from my face. He's been watching my house for weeks. He knows when Mrs. Chen comes by, when you leave for work, when you get home. He knows you installed security cameras, but he's figured out the blind spots. I thought about all those evenings I'd spent alone in grandmother's house, feeling safe behind locked doors and electronic alarms. The idea that David had been out there, watching, planning, made me physically sick. What does he want? Money? I can't give him the inheritance. It's tied up in legal proceedings. He doesn't want money anymore. He wants revenge. He blames you for destroying his life, for taking away his perfect plan. He says if he can't have the money, he'll make sure you can't either, by killing me. Sarah, you need police protection. Real protection, not just a security system. I hung up and immediately called Detective Rodriguez. Detective, I need to report additional information about my husband's assault claim. I have reason to believe he injured himself deliberately and that he may be planning to harm me. Mrs. Morrison, that's a serious accusation. I have a witness willing to testify. David's brother Marcus was involved in the original fraud scheme, but he's ready to cooperate in exchange for immunity. There was a pause. Can you come to the station? We need to discuss this in detail. As I gathered my things to leave the office, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You can't hide behind lawyers and police forever. We need to finish this conversation face to face. Tonight. D. I forwarded the message to Detective Rodriguez immediately, then called Ms. Walsh. Pack a bag, she said without preamble. You're not going home tonight. We're getting you a hotel room under a false name until the police can arrest David. He's been watching the house for weeks. He knows about the security system, the blind spots, everything. Then it's a good thing you're not going back there. Sarah, listen to me carefully. This situation has moved beyond civil litigation. David has crossed the line into criminal threats. From now until he's in custody, you don't go anywhere alone, and you don't go anywhere predictable. As I left my office building, I found myself scanning the street for David's car, looking over my shoulder at every footstep behind me. The independence and strength I'd been building over the past month felt suddenly fragile in the face of real physical danger. But underneath the fear, I felt something else. A fierce determination not to let David win. He'd already stolen 5 years of my life through deception. I would not let him steal the rest of it through intimidation. Grandmother had survived in a man's world by being tougher and smarter than her competition. She'd built an empire and protected her family through strength and careful planning. Now, it was my turn to prove I was worthy of her legacy. David wanted to finish our conversation face to face. Fine, but it would be in a police station, with him in handcuffs, and me finally free of his manipulation forever. The war was almost over. I just had to survive long enough to win it. Epilogue. 6 months later, I signed the final papers on my new office lease and handed them back to the real estate agent with a smile. The space was perfect. Bright, modern, and large enough for the marketing consultancy I was starting with 2 former colleagues who decided to leave the corporate world behind. Whitmore Creative Solutions would officially open next month, specializing in helping women-owned businesses develop their brand strategies. The name was a tribute to grandmother, but the vision was entirely my own. David was serving 18 months in federal prison for fraud, forgery, and making terroristic threats. Marcus had received probation in exchange for his testimony, and both men had been ordered to pay full restitution, not that there was much left to recover from their offshore accounts. The divorce had been finalized 2 months ago. I'd kept grandmother's house and all of her assets, while David got exactly what he deserved, nothing. Mrs. Chen had agreed to stay on as my housekeeper and unofficial guardian, though I suspected she enjoyed our evening conversations more than the actual housework. She'd become like family to me, one of the few people who'd known both grandmother and me well enough to understand what this journey had meant. Your grandmother would be proud, she told me just last week as we planned the garden renovation. You found your steel spine. I thought about that as I walked back to my car in the bright spring sunshine. The past 6 months had been the hardest of my life, but also the most transformative. I'd learned to trust my instincts, to value my own judgment, and to build a life based on my own dreams rather than someone else's expectations. My phone buzzed with a text from my new business partner. First client meeting confirmed for Monday. She heard about us from Janet. Apparently you made quite an impression during your last project. I smiled as I typed back, looking forward to it. This is going to be amazing. As I drove home through the city, I was learning to see with new eyes. I thought about grandmother's final letter to me. Be bold, my dear one. Be bold and be brilliant and be entirely yourself. I was finally learning how to do exactly that. The woman who had trusted blindly was gone, replaced by someone who trusted herself above all others. The woman who had settled for being an accessory in someone else's life was gone, replaced by someone who was building her own empire. David had tried to destroy me, but instead he'd freed me. In losing everything I thought I wanted, I'd found everything I actually needed, and that I knew was the best revenge of all.